The heat was a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on the shoulders of the silent crowd and drew the moisture from every open mouth, leaving behind the taste of dust and judgment. It shimmered above the baked earth of the town square, distorting the edges of the blacksmith's forge and the flat false fronts of the general store and the land office, making the world waver, as if seen through cheap glass. At the center of that wavering world, a man held an iron, its tip a glowing ember of orange that pulsed with a life of its own. A malevolent heart dragged from the forge's core. He was a thick man, the town smith, his face impassive and beaded with sweat that traced clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. And he held the instrument of punishment with the same detached competence he used to shape a horseshoe. He was not cruel. He was a tool, same as the iron. The cruelty was in the stillness of the people watching, in the cool, satisfied expression of the man in the clean duster who stood near the watering trough, his name Mister Barlow. His authority as solid and unquestioned as the stone foundation of the bank he owned. Before the smith, a girl knelt in the dust, her hands bound behind her back with a length of rough rope that had already chafed her wrists raw. She was little more than a slip of a thing, her dress torn at the shoulder and her face smudged with dirt and tears, but her back was straight, a thin line of defiance in the suffocating heat. She did not plead or cry out, not anymore. The sound had been baked out of her, leaving only a tremor in her shoulders that she could not control. The charge had been read an hour before, a formal drone from the mouth of the part-time sheriff, the words simple and damning. Theft, a silver locket engraved with the initials of Barlow's late wife, gone from his study. The girl, who had been taken on to dust the shelves and sweep the floors, was the only one with the opportunity. There was no trial, not really. There was only Barlow's word against the terrified silence of an orphan, with no people and no name to speak of. His word was currency in this town, hers was dust. The smith took one step forward, the heat of the iron rolling off it in a visible wave. The crowd leaned in, a collective, silent intake of breath. The girl flinched, her eyes screwing shut, but she did not make a sound. Barlow watched, his lips a thin, unsmiling line. He was not interested in justice. He was interested in lessons. An example must be made, he had said, so that others might understand the sanctity of property, the order of things. The glowing letter T descended, a brand not for cattle, but for a human being, designed to mark her as a pariah, to make her untouchable, to ensure that wherever she went, she would be known by this single, searing moment. The smell of burning hair and then flesh filled the air, sharp and sickening. A low gasp went through the crowd, a ripple of something that might have been horror or might have been grim satisfaction. A single choked sob finally broke from the girl's lips, a sound of pure animal pain. Then it was over. The smith stepped back, the iron now a dull, angry red. He dropped it into a bucket of water with a furious hiss of steam. The girl slumped forward, held up only by her bonds, her cheek pressed into the hot dust. No one moved to help her. The lesson had been delivered. The crowd began to disperse, melting back into the shops and saloons, eager to escape the smell and the lingering image of the girl in the dirt, their complicity settling over them like another layer of dust. Barlow gave a curt nod to the sheriff, who untied the girl's hands with rough indifference and shoved her toward the edge of town. "Get," that was all he said. She stumbled away, clutching her wounded shoulder, a small broken figure disappearing into the shimmering heat of the road that led out into the vast, unforgiving emptiness of the plains. Afternoon, the sun was a hammer, beating down on the dry, cracked earth of Silas's small plot of land, 160 acres of mostly rock and stubborn grama grass that he had wrestled from the wilderness with his own 2 hands. He was mending a fence line, the work slow and methodical, each movement precise and economical, because he had learned long ago that wasted motion was wasted energy, and energy was the only true currency he possessed. He worked alone, as he always did, the silence of the high plains broken only by the rhythmic scrape of his shovel against stone, the grunt of effort as he set a new post, and the patient sigh of his single gray gelding, who stood tethered nearby, his tail flicking at the persistent flies. Silas was a man carved from the same material as the land he worked, weathered and quiet, his face a roadmap of sun and wind, his hands calloused and competent. He did not speak unless speech was necessary, and he found it was necessary far less often than other men seemed to. His world was one of physical truths, the heft of an axe, the thirst of the soil, the coming of a storm front, the predictable patterns of the sun and stars. He had come to this place years ago to escape a world that ran on words, on promises and lies that shifted like sand, and he had built a life that was as solid and dependable as the locust posts he was now tamping into the ground. He could see the town from the rise where he worked, a distant collection of smudges on the horizon, a place he visited only when necessity demanded, for salt or flour or cartridges. He had no use for its politics, for the quiet hierarchies and unspoken rules that governed the men who gathered in the saloons and the women who whispered behind their hands in the mercantile. He had heard the talk, of course, the casual branding of a girl for theft, and he had felt the familiar, cold knot in his gut, the distaste for the kind of men who derived their strength from the weakness of others. He had seen Barlow in town, a man whose clean hands and starched collar seemed an affront to the gritty reality of the land, a man who moved with an unearned certainty that set Silas's teeth on edge. But it was not his affair. His fence was his affair. The thirst of his horse was his affair. The coming night was his affair. He finished tamping the post, the wood solid in the earth, a small victory against the entropy that was always trying to pull his world apart. He gathered his tools, his movements unhurried, coiling the wire with a practiced efficiency that was almost beautiful in its simplicity. He gave the gelding a scratch behind the ears, the horse leaning into his touch with a soft nicker. They understood each other, he and the horse. Theirs was a partnership based on mutual respect and shared labor, a language of pressure and release that required no words. As he turned to lead the horse back toward the small, sod-roofed cabin that sat like a natural outcropping near a shallow creek, he saw it. A flicker of movement near the line of cottonwoods that marked his water source. It was not a deer or a coyote. The shape was wrong. Too small. Too slow. He stopped, his body going utterly still, his eyes narrowing against the glare. He was a man who noticed things, who had survived by noticing things. And what he noticed now was a heap of torn fabric and human misery collapsed at the edge of his property, not 10 yards from the new section of fence he had just repaired. He did not move for a long time, watching, his face a mask of stone. It was trouble. He could feel it, a disruption to the hard-won piece of his world, a complication he had not asked for and did not want. He could turn around, lead his horse to the barn, and pretend he had not seen. By morning, the problem would likely have resolved itself, one way or another. The coyotes were always hungry. It was the law of the land, a harsh but simple arithmetic. He stood there as the sun began to dip toward the mountains, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple, and he thought of the fence post he had just set, how it stood straight and true, because he had taken the time to dig the hole deep and tamp the earth firm around it. A thing was either right or it was not. A post was either plumb or it was crooked. He let out a slow breath, the sound lost in the vastness. He tied the gelding's reins to a scrubby bush and began to walk toward the collapsed figure, his boots crunching softly on the dry ground, each step a conscious choice, a departure from the simple, solitary path he had laid for himself. He knelt beside her, the smell of dust and fever and blood rising to meet him. It was the girl from town. He had seen her from a distance once or twice, a fleeting shape sweeping the boardwalk, but now she was a tangle of limbs and desperation at his feet. Her face was pale beneath the grime, her lips cracked and bloodless. Her left shoulder was a mess of swollen, angry flesh, the fabric of her dress fused to the wound by dried blood and weeping fluid. The brand was a crude, terrifying thing, a violent declaration burned into her skin, a T for thief, for throwaway. He could see the faint tremor that ran through her body, the shiver of a high fever. Her breath was a shallow, ragged whisper in her throat. He placed the back of his calloused hand against her forehead. She was burning up. He looked at the wound again, at the angry red lines spreading out from it, a sign of infection that would kill her as surely as a bullet if left untended. He had seen its like before, in men and in animals. He knew what it meant. He remained kneeling for a moment, the setting sun casting his long shadow over her. His mind, usually so clear and uncluttered, was a turmoil of conflicting impulses. To help her was to invite the town's judgment into his world. It was to take on her crime, to stand with the accused. Barlow was not a man who would let this go. To take her in was to pick a fight he had spent years avoiding. To leave her was to be no better than the crowd that had watched in silence. He would have to look at this spot every day and know he had left her to die at the edge of his fence. He would become a man who pretended not to see. He rose, his decision made not in a flash of moral clarity, but in a slow, grim acceptance of what he had to do. He walked back to his horse, unstrapped his canteen, and returned to her side. He uncapped it and gently, carefully, poured a small trickle of water onto her lips. She stirred, a low moan escaping her, her eyelids fluttering. Her eyes, when they opened, were clouded with pain and fever, and they looked at him with the raw terror of a cornered animal. "Easy," he said, the word rough from disuse, little more than a gravelly whisper. He slid one arm under her knees and the other behind her back, taking care to avoid her injured shoulder. She was lighter than a sack of feed. He lifted her, her head lolling against his chest, and a fresh wave of heat radiated from her body. She was a brand herself, a fever brand in his arms. He carried her toward the cabin, his steps slow and steady. The gelding watched him, his ears pricked forward, and let out a low woof of curiosity. The cabin was a single room, Spartan and clean. A narrow cot was pushed against one wall, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center, and a stone fireplace dominated the far end. He laid her gently on his own cot, the straw-stuffed mattress rustling beneath her slight weight. For a moment, he just stood there, looking down at her, a foreign element in his meticulously ordered world. The neat stacks of firewood, the polished rifle hanging over the mantel, the clean-swept floor, it was all a testament to his control. And she was chaos. He turned and went to the fireplace, stoking the embers from his morning fire and adding a few small pieces of kindling. He filled a kettle with water from the bucket by the door and set it on the hook to warm. From a small locked chest at the foot of his cot, he retrieved a clean linen cloth, a bar of lye soap, and a small tin of dark, pungent salve he made himself from pine tar and yarrow. These were his medicines, for horse and for man. He returned to her side. "This is going to hurt," he said, not as an apology, but as a statement of fact. She flinched as he reached for the hem of her dress near the wound, her eyes wide with fear. "I have to clean it." Her voice, when it came, was a dry crackle. "Leave me." He paused, his hands hovering over the ruined fabric. He looked at her, truly looked at her, past the fever and the dirt. He saw not a thief, but a child fighting a battle she had already lost. "Can't," he said, and the word was as final as a stone set in the earth. With a surgeon's care, he used his pocket knife to cut away the cloth around the brand, the fabric peeling away from the weeping wound with an awful, sticky sound. She cried out, a sharp, high sound of agony that she quickly bit back between her teeth, her whole body rigid on the cot. He worked quickly, his hands steady, his face grim. He washed the wound with the warm water and the harsh soap, his touch surprisingly gentle as he cleaned away the filth. He ignored her whimpers, the tremors that shook her frame, focusing only on the task, on the fight against the poison that was spreading through her. When it was clean, a raw, red, horrifying letter seared into her flesh. He took a generous amount of the dark salve and spread it over the entire area. The pine tar would sting, but it would also seal it from the air and draw out the infection. He wrapped the wound with the clean linen cloth, his knots firm and sure. The whole time she watched him, her breath coming in ragged gasps, tears tracking clean lines through the dirt on her face. He had inflicted more pain on her, but it was a pain with a purpose, a cleansing fire, not the pointless cruelty of the town square. When he was done, he pulled a coarse wool blanket over her. He took a dipper of cool water from the bucket and held it to her lips. She drank, her eyes never leaving his, a question hanging in their fevered depths, a question he had no answer for. He simply stood up, wiped his hands on his trousers, and went back to his work, leaving her to the mercy of the fever and the healing dark. That night, he did not sleep. He sat in one of the hardback chairs, his rifle across his lap, and listened to her ragged breathing in the darkness, the silence of his home now filled with the sound of another's pain. He was no longer alone, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that the world he had tried so hard to keep at bay was now on its way to his door. Days later, the fever broke. It left her weak and hollowed out, but the angry red around the wound had subsided, the swelling gone down. The brand was beginning to heal, the edges scabbing over, a permanent, ugly scar that would forever tell a story she had not written. She spent most of her time sleeping, and when she was awake, she watched him with wide, silent eyes as he moved about the cabin. She did not speak, and he did not press her. He would leave food for her on a stool by the cot, a bowl of thin broth, a piece of hard bread, and when he returned, the bowl would be empty. He changed the dressing on her shoulder every morning, the process becoming a silent ritual. She no longer flinched from his touch, but endured it with a stillness that matched his own, a quiet acceptance of this strange, gruff charity. He He learned her name was Alara, not because she told him, but because she had whispered it once in the height of her fever. A desperate, pleading sound in the night. He never used it. To him, she was just the girl. His life fell into a new rhythm. He still mended his fences, tended his horse, and worked his small garden, but his solitude was now punctuated by the presence of another. He found himself listening for her breathing when he came in from the cold, noting the small signs of her recovery. The day she was able to sit up on her own, the day she took the bowl from his hand instead of waiting for him to set it down. Her presence was a constant, low-grade tension in his world, a question mark hanging in the air. He did not know what he would do with her when she was well enough to travel. He did not know what she would do. They existed in a state of suspension. Two solitary planets knocked into a shared, uncertain orbit. Then one morning, the dust came. He saw it first, a plume rising from the direction of the town road, too deliberate for a dust devil, too large for a single rider. He watched it from the cabin door, his face impassive, but a cold knot tightened in his stomach. He had known this was coming. He had been waiting for it. He turned back into the cabin. Alara was sitting on the edge of the cot, her bare feet on the cool dirt floor. She had seen the dust plume too. The color had drained from her face, leaving it a sickly white. The terror was back in her eyes, raw and immediate. "Go out the back," he said, his voice low and even. "Follow the creek bed north. Don't stop." She stared at him, her expression a mixture of fear and confusion. She didn't move. "Go," he repeated, his voice sharper this time, a command that brooked no argument. He took his rifle from its pegs over the mantel, checked the load, and walked outside, pulling the heavy plank door shut behind him. He did not watch to see if she obeyed. He had given her a chance. The rest was up to her. He walked to the center of his yard and stood there, his rifle held loosely in one hand, its butt resting on the ground. He was not a gunslinger, not a man looking for a fight, but the rifle was a part of him. A tool as familiar as his axe or his hammer. Its presence was a statement. He waited. The riders resolved out of the dust cloud, 3 of them. At the front was Barlow, looking as clean and out of place as ever, his duster immaculate despite the ride. He rode a fine black mare that danced nervously, sensing the tension in the air. Flanking him were the sheriff, a man whose authority was borrowed and whose gaze never quite met anyone's, and a burly, slat-faced man Silas recognized as one of Barlow's hired hands. They reined in about 20 feet from him, the horses stamping and blowing in the sudden stillness. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Barlow surveyed the small, hard-scrabble ranch with a look of faint disdain, his eyes taking in the sod-roofed cabin, the patched corral, the man standing before him. "Silas," Barlow said, his voice smooth and polite, the sound of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "We haven't had the pleasure." Silas said nothing. He just waited, his body still, his presence a silent wall. "We're looking for something," Barlow continued, his gaze flicking toward the cabin door. "Something that belongs to me, a thief. Carries my mark on her shoulder. We have reason to believe she came this way." The sheriff shifted in his saddle, looking uncomfortable. The hired man just stared at Silas, his hand resting on the butt of the pistol, holstered at his hip. The sun beat down. A hawk circled high overhead, a lonely speck in an endless blue sky. Silas could feel the weight of their collective gaze, the pressure of their purpose. He could end this now. He could step aside, tell them he had found her and sent her on her way. He could wash his hands of it, return to his solitude, to the quiet, uncomplicated rhythm of his life. He thought of her small, fevered body on his cot. He thought of the raw, weeping wound on her shoulder. He thought of the silent crowds and the men who used their power like a brand. His gaze did not waver from Barlow's. "You have no reason to be on my land," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. It was not a denial. It was a dismissal. A muscle twitched in Barlow's jaw. His polite facade tightened. "Now see here," the sheriff started, his voice a nervous bluster. "We have the law on our side." "Your law stops at my fence," Silas said, his eyes still locked on Barlow. He was not talking to the sheriff. He was talking to the man who held the leash. Barlow smiled, a cold, thin-lipped expression that did not reach his eyes. "I admire a man who values his property, Silas. I truly do, which is why you'll understand I must retrieve what is mine. The girl is a thief. She is marked. The matter is settled." "Not for me," Silas said. The words were quiet, but they landed in the tense air with the weight of stones. "Not here, not today." Barlow's smile vanished. His eyes went cold and hard. the thin veneer of civility stripped away to reveal the raw steel of his will beneath. He had expected deference, or fear. He had not expected this quiet, immovable obstinacy from a man who had nothing. "This is a mistake," Barlow said softly. "You are a man alone. You have a nice, quiet life here. It would be a shame if something were to disrupt it. A fire, perhaps, or a misunderstanding with the law." The threat was clear, delivered with the same casual cruelty as the brand had been. It was transactional. "Give me what I want, or I will burn your world to the ground." Silas's grip tightened on the rifle, the wood smooth and familiar in his hand. He could see the hired man's hand tense on his pistol. He could feel the moment balancing on a knife's edge. He did not raise the rifle. He simply stood his ground, a solitary, weathered post, holding firm against the storm. He had built this life from nothing, and he would not let it be defined by the fear of a man like Barlow. He would not become one of the silent watchers. From behind him, from inside the cabin, came a small sound, the scrape of a chair leg on the dirt floor. She hadn't run, she had stayed, and in that moment, something shifted in Silas. This was no longer just about his own integrity. It was about hers. "I said," Silas repeated, his voice dropping even lower, carrying across the still air with an unnerving clarity, "You have no reason to be on my land." He took one small, deliberate step forward, a minimal shift of weight that was somehow more menacing than a shout. The rifle remained pointed at the ground, but his thumb brushed the hammer, a small, almost imperceptible movement that Barlow did not miss. The hired man's hand tightened on his gun, his knuckles white. The sheriff licked his dry lips, his eyes darting between Silas and Barlow. A man caught between a rock and a hard place, and wishing he were anywhere else. Barlow's composure finally cracked. A flicker of genuine anger crossed his face, the frustration of a man whose power had just met an obstacle it could not simply push aside. He was used to a world that bent to his will, and this silent, stubborn man in the dirt yard was refusing to bend. "The girl is a common thief," Barlow hissed, his voice losing its polished edge. "She stole a silver locket from my desk, a piece of great sentimental value. She is marked as such by the law. You are harboring a branded criminal, Silas. That makes you one too." Silas remained silent, letting Barlow's words hang in the hot, dry air. He knew that arguing was pointless. Barlow's truth was the only one that mattered in the town square. But this was not the town square. This was his land. And here, other truths might find purchase. He had spent the last few days in the quiet company of the girl, Alara. He had seen the way she folded the blanket on the cot when she rose, a small, neat gesture of order in the midst of her pain. He had seen the way her fingers, though thin and weak, traced the grain of the wooden table as if reading a story there. They were not the hands of a common thief. They were hands that knew something else, something quiet and precise. During one of his trips to the chest for clean linen, she had seen the contents, not just medical supplies, but a set of drafting tools, rolled in oilcloth, a compass, a ruler, fine-nibbed pens, relics from a life he had left behind. A time when he had worked for the railroad, surveying land, his own hands capable of a precision that had nothing to do with digging post holes. Her eyes had lit up with a flicker of recognition, a spark of something other than fear, before she had quickly looked away. He had filed that observation away, as he did all things. Now he drew on it. He spoke, not to Barlow, but as if making a general statement to the hawk circling overhead. "A locket," he said, the words slow and thoughtful. "Small thing, easy to hide, easy to lose." He finally shifted his gaze from Barlow to the nervous sheriff. "What else was on that desk?" The sheriff looked to Barlow, who gave a curt, irritated nod. "Papers," the sheriff said. "Ledgers, a map he was drawing." "A map," Silas repeated, the word hanging in the air. He turned his head slightly, just enough to call toward the cabin door. "Girl." The door creaked open. Alara stood there, framed in the dark doorway, a pale ghost in a borrowed man's shirt that hung on her frail frame. Her eyes were wide with terror, but she stood straight, her chin up. She was no longer the broken thing in the dust. "Barlow says you stole a locket," Silas said, his voice even. "He says you're a thief." She flinched at the word, but she did not look away. Her gaze was fixed on Silas. "He also says there was a map on his desk," Silas continued, his eyes now moving back to Barlow, pinning him with their intensity. "A survey of the North Range he was working on." Barlow's eyes narrowed. "What of it?" "A map like that," Silas said, "takes a steady hand, a practiced eye. not something just anyone can do. He gestured with his head toward the yard. Bring the stool and the board from under the cot. Alara disappeared for a moment, then returned, carrying the small three-legged stool and a smooth, planed plank of wood he used for sketching repairs. She placed them on the ground a few feet from where he stood. He then looked at Barlow. You want your justice. You want to prove she's a thief. Let's see what she is. He walked into the cabin, leaving the three riders in a state of confused tension. He returned a moment later with the oilcloth roll and a small bottle of ink. He unrolled it on the ground, revealing the gleaming brass and steel of the drafting tools. He handed a fine-nibbed pen to Alara. Draw my fence line, he said, his voice quiet. From here to the creek, show the cottonwoods, show the rise to the west. She stared at him, her hand trembling as she took the pen. Then she looked at the tools, at the clean board, and something shifted in her face. The fear receded, replaced by a flicker of intense concentration. She knelt in the dirt, placed the board on the stool, dipped the pen in the ink, and began to draw. Barlow watched, a sneer on his lips. What is this foolishness? A parlor trick? But Silas ignored him. He stood guard, his rifle once again resting on the ground, his body a silent sentinel between her and them. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic scratch of the pen on the wood. She worked with a speed and confidence that was breathtaking. Her hand, which had trembled moments before, was now steady as a rock. The lines she drew were clean and precise, the curves of the creek bed rendered with a fluid grace. She added details with tiny deft strokes. The cluster of three large rocks near the gate, the slight dip in the land where water pooled after a rain, the distinctive shape of the oldest cottonwood tree. It was not just a sketch, it was a cartographer's work, an act of technical and artistic skill that was as undeniable as the sun in the sky. She was not just drawing what she saw, she was rendering the world with an intimate mathematical understanding. The hired man leaned forward in his saddle, his mouth slightly agape. Even the sheriff was watching, his face a mask of grudging admiration. The map grew on the board, a perfect miniature replica of Silas's small world, created from memory and observation in a matter of minutes. When she was finished, she set the pen down. She did not look up for approval. She simply looked at her work, her expression distant, lost in the act of creation. Silas nudged the board with the toe of his boot, turning it for Barlow to see. A girl who can do that, Silas said, his voice as flat and hard as the land around them. A girl with a hand like that, she has no need of your silver locket. He let the statement sink in. The accusation of petty theft, of a clumsy, opportunistic crime, suddenly seemed absurd, ridiculous in the face of this profound and delicate skill. A person with this gift, this discipline, was not a common thief scrabbling for trinkets. She was an artist, an engineer. She was something more. Barlow stared at the map, his face a thundercloud of fury and humiliation. He had been outmaneuvered, not by force, but by a quiet truth he could not dispute. He had branded her a worthless thief, and this silent man had just proven her worth in a way that shamed him completely. He had lost. He had lost face in front of his hired man and the town sheriff, and he knew it. He jerked the reins of his horse, the animal rearing slightly in protest. This changes nothing, he snarled. But the words were hollow, his authority shattered. The mark is there. She is what I say she is. Not here, Silas said. Not anymore. Barlow stared at him for a long, hate-filled moment. Then, without another word, he wheeled his horse around and spurred it back toward the town road, a cloud of angry dust rising in his wake. The sheriff and the hired man hesitated for a moment, then followed, leaving Silas and Alara alone in the silent yard, the intricate map lying between them like a treaty. She had not been proven innocent. She had been proven worthy. And in this place, that was the only verdict that mattered. Weeks later, the oppressive heat of summer had finally broken, giving way to the crisp, clear air of early autumn. The sun was gentler now, the light golden instead of white, and the cottonwood leaves along the creek were beginning to turn a brilliant yellow. The fence line was finished, stretching straight and true across the rolling land, a testament to a season of hard, shared work. The rhythm of the ranch had settled into a new, quiet harmony, a duet where there had once been a solo. Alara moved with a quiet confidence now, the haunted, hunted look gone from her eyes. The wound on her shoulder had healed into a puckered, star-shaped scar, a permanent reminder of the cruelty of men, but it no longer defined her. She wore it not as a mark of shame, but as a testament to her own survival. She had taken to the work of the ranch with a surprising aptitude, her sharp eyes and steady hands finding purpose in everything she did. She learned to mend harnesses, her stitches small and neat. She learned the language of the gelding, her voice soft and patient as she curried his coat. She was a quick study, her mind absorbing the details of this new life, the logic of the seasons, the needs of the land. The drafting tools were no longer hidden away in the chest. They now sat on a small new shelf Silas had built for her by the window, alongside jars of ink she had learned to make herself from oak galls and charcoal. In the evenings, after the work was done, she would often sit at the table, the light of a tallow lamp illuminating her bent head as she worked on her maps. She had mapped Silas's entire property with a jeweler's precision, and then, from memory, she began to map the surrounding lands, the trails she had traveled, the terrain she had crossed. It was as if she were reclaiming the world by committing it to paper, ordering the chaos, making it her own. Silas would sit in his chair by the cooling fireplace, cleaning his rifle or oiling a piece of tack, and he would watch her. He rarely spoke, and she rarely spoke to him, but the silence between them was no longer one of tension or uncertainty. It was a comfortable, shared space, a quiet understanding that had grown between them like the tough grass that held the soil together. They were two solitary people who had found an unlikely harbor in each other's company. One evening, she looked up from her work, a new map spread before her. It was a map of the region, but with proposed new routes, better paths for finding water, safer passages through the rocky canyons. It was a work of profound vision and practicality. "The spring that feeds this creek," she said, her voice soft but clear, "it comes from a source higher up in the hills. If you were to dig a new well here," she pointed to a spot on the map, and then gestured out the window toward a barren-looking patch of ground, "you would find water, clean water, enough for more than one horse." He looked from the map to her face, lit by the warm lamplight. He saw not the branded girl, not the victim, but a partner, a person of substance and skill. He saw the future of this place, a future that was suddenly larger and more hopeful than the one he had envisioned for himself. He had taken her in to save her from the world, but he was slowly realizing that she was the one who was saving him from his own isolation, from the slow, grinding solitude that he had mistaken for peace. He gave a slow, single nod. "Tomorrow," he said, "we'll start digging." She smiled, a small, genuine smile that transformed her face, and turned back to her map. The lamp cast their two shadows on the wall behind them, two separate figures joined in the quiet work of building a life. Outside, a cool wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of pine and turning earth. The world was still a hard place, full of men like Barlow, but here, in this small cabin, on this small patch of land, they had carved out something true. Dignity had been lost in the dust of a town square, and it had been found again in the shared labor of a mended fence, in the quiet respect of a shared meal, and in the beautiful, undeniable truth of a map drawn by a steady, worthy hand. We are so quick to write a person's story for them, to see a brand or a stumble, and mistake it for the final chapter. We draw our lines, issue our judgments, and build our fences, certain we know where worth resides. But how often do we truly look? How often do we stop to see the steady hand that has been dismissed, to listen for the quiet truth that has been shouted down? The world will always have its Barlows, men who deal in the currency of shame and fear, who believe that marking another makes them clean. They build their power on the idea that some people are simply worth less than others. But worth is not a thing that can be given or taken away by a crowd. It isn't found in a silver locket or a clean duster. It is a thing that resides within, a quiet, resilient core of skill and dignity and strength. It's in the hand that can draw a perfect line, the back that can straighten after being bent, the heart that can choose to help a stranger at the fence line, even when it is the harder path. It is proven not by argument, but by action, not with a shout, but with the quiet, undeniable evidence of a life being lived with purpose. Perhaps the greatest test of our own character is not how we treat the powerful, but how we see the fallen. Do we see a thief to be cast out, or do we see a skill to be recognized? Do we join the silent crowd, or do we stand in the yard and say, "Not here, not today"? Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story meant something to you, we hope you'll take a moment to leave a comment and share your thoughts. Your presence here makes this community what it is, and for that, we are truly grateful.